Few thoughts today around the sermon title, Rebel with a Cause. The title, I think, deserves a brief explanation. It's not so much about the play with the title Rebel Without a Cause. I was called that by officer commanding when I was doing my military service in South Africa. A very regimental officer commanding that joined our unit after I've been there for a year or so. And it was an unconventional unit, and we didn't really abide by all the rules and regulations. So my hair was a bit long for a chaplain. And he looked at me the first time he said to me, "And you, James Dean, rebel without a cause, what are you doing here?" So I had to shave my James Dean hair. Rebel with a cause, I hope that'll become clear during the sermon. Or 3 weeks ago, over the weekend, it was a long weekend for me. Not long in the duration of the days that one had off, but long in working hours. I had to attend the Board of Directors meeting of the Massachusetts Conference, and that started on Friday afternoon with books we had to read and prepare for conversation, and it went until 10 o'clock that night in Framingham, and then started the next morning at 8 o'clock again and went to 4 o'clock. No, I'm not a lover of meetings, and I'm very selective about retreats, but with this one I didn't have much of a choice. But I vouch for this church that Friday evening after a very long work session and conversation, which was focused on evaluating the time that we live in and what is required of the church, and what leadership, specifically the Board of Directors, should provide to the churches in the conference. After very long conversations and intense discussions, which was more or less focused on what role the church can play to bear testimony and to testify to what is right, to see that justice is done. I was a lone voice, mentioning something else. And after a while and in further discussions, I realized why perhaps I was a lone voice for something else. Most of the people represented around the table, I think it's around 30 or so, meeting with the staff of the conference and the other directors, they were members of churches that were more or less monolithic in their convictions. They were mostly very progressive, liberal, and I didn't hear much of a more conservative perspective also offered. And after listening to this, and for a very long time, I said, wait a minute, I think the church is also in the business of reconciliation. And I had good, apart from the Bible to back me up, it is in the mission of the Massachusetts Conference, where it says there the church should play, or the conference should play, a leading role in facilitating conversations between people with different perspectives. That is what we state that we believe we are called to. And I must confess, I didn't know that at that time, that it is in the mission. So I spoke up and I said, no, I think we should also play that role, to be a vehicle for reconciliation. Because I said, as I've said many times, if we cannot as church members and as people of God find common ground to say this is what the gospel compels us to do, no matter what times we live in, or especially in difficult times, then who will do it? If we do not accept the responsibility of reconciliation and of finding common ground to say this is how we will proceed as God's people, no matter what political party we belong to, no matter what our political perspectives are. And they said, well, that is impossible. It cannot happen. Because they say people don't want to talk to each other, they don't mix, they just separate like the Red Sea. And I said, yeah, that's most often the case. But I said, I can show you people that are talking to each other and that stick together and without avoiding the issues are able to have conversations. We don't have a formal program to do that. I'm working on that. I first tested the waters and see if I'll still have a job after the initial efforts. But you know, I'm very serious about it, and we will continue. I've invited a speaker from Middlebury College, a friend of mine, Professor Alison Stanger, who was attacked when she tried to facilitate a speaker. I think he belongs to MIT, who wrote a book that people were upset about. He has a more conservative approach, and she tried to facilitate him speaking there, and she was attacked so that she just came out of therapy in Michigan. I will shortly confirm the date. But after she was attacked and I read what her perspective is, and I know that she also very firmly believes that we should be able to hear different perspectives, and as a Christian, her father was a UCC minister as well. She also believes that we should be able to talk to one another and find the common ground. So I've invited her, and then also I will try to schedule specific times when we can gather and enter into these conversations so that the learning curve that we have gone through will continue and that we don't have to start from scratch again. So I vouched for you, and I said, I know people, and I live with them, who are able to talk to one another even though they differ radically when it comes to political issues. In that sense, this church is bucking the trend, doing it differently. We are rebels. I hope with a cause. There's another trend that we are bucking, and that is illustrated these 10 days at the Topsfield Fair. Among the, I don't know, probably 100 or so food vendors, there are 2 non-profits left that have a booth there. It's us and B'nai B'rith, who sells wonderful Jewish food. It's on the way to our booth. Just when you enter, you can make a stop there and try it. I think they use about 200 volunteers, and I think they differ from us in the sense that they not only, or that they don't represent one synagogue's B'nai B'rith, but a broader movement. So it's perhaps easier, they have a bigger pool of people to draw on. But they've been there, I think, for 53 years, so we've been at the fair for a bit longer. The Middlebury, or the Middleton Congregational Church, voted to give up their booth. So this is the first year, and I don't know how many years that they are not there. And I fully understand that. it is getting increasingly tough to find the people to do that work for a number of reasons. It is so that the church population is aging faster than the rest of the population. It's not because church is so bad that people get older faster if they belong to a church, but there are just more elderly people present in churches than in the average or the general population. So our faithful workers at the fair, for instance, many more are plagued by ailments that make it difficult for them to be on their feet that long, or to lift the pot full of gravy or stock high enough so that they can perform the functions of a cook, etc., etc. It's never been easy to buck a trend. It's not easy because you're swimming against the current, you're walking into the prevailing winds, you're doing something that is different from what the environment dictates to you is the easiest way to do things. If you look at the UCC and all Christian denominations, including the evangelical churches and even the charismatic churches, the trend is unmistakable. You see a downward trend in membership, you see a downward trend in income, and you see a downward trend in the output that one could expect, mission work, etc. We have, I think we're part of that broader trend, this church, if you look over 50 years. But we've been able to at least stabilize downward trends over the past few years. I'm very grateful for that. But I shared with the church council my analysis at the last council meeting, when was that, Thursday evening, that we have a core group of members that are all, if they don't dye their hair, testifying to the fact that they are getting older. Then there is a gap, and then we have younger families moving in. So for homecoming, the elderly folk, or those people who don't have children in school anymore, do not have to return here for homecoming Sunday, because homecoming Sunday is just another Sunday on the calendar. You can stay longer at your place where you go on vacation. You can go do the cheap vacations now that is not within season. And we have to start thinking about it in our thinking about our church and the future. The conventional wisdom is normally the easiest wisdom. In our scripture reading, we find an example of an unconventional thinker, of somebody that defied the conventional wisdom and the practices and the thinking and the practice of religion. Religion that he was part of the Jewish religion. We find testimony of that in the Old Testament as well. In the book of Ecclesiastes, we find the uncommon wisdom, the wisdom that said, no, the conventional wisdom is not right. Especially that part that says, live a good life and God will reward you for it through material possessions and so forth. Ecclesiastes questions that. Jesus also questions many of the practices of the religious leaders and of the establishment, the temple and the institutions around it of his day. Strange, he was invited by an interesting figure, most probably, one of the Pharisees, one of the leaders, one of the teachers of that religion. Invited to his house, which is strange. Because when you had a meal, and especially if you invited them to your house, you declared through that action You accepted that person as your equal and as somebody close enough to you that you will invite them to the most intimate setting. You dined with people that you accepted fully and that you would like to be associated with. So for a religious leader that Jesus were criticizing to be invited to his house, that is rather strange. And one would think a wise man like Jesus would, rein in his horses a bit. But right at the outset, we read in this passage, he laid into his host. And he concluded his criticism by saying, you are like an unwashed grave, unmarked grave, because it was customary as part of the function of the religious establishment to mark the graves, because they were regarded in Jewish law as something that would make you impure. And when you are impure, you're not fit for social interaction, and especially not to go to the temple or practice any kind of religious action. So when you would walk across a grave or get within a certain distance of a corpse or a grave, you would be impure, and that required you to separate you from other people, go through certain purification rites, which involved normally an offering as well, which you had to go and buy at the temple. So if you are poor, which 90% of the Jewish population was at that stage, and you walked over an unmarked grave, somebody made you aware of it, you had to be separated from other people, and then you had to buy this offering and do the sacrifice, and then you could be accepted into the community again. And Jesus said, you Pharisees that focus so much on the letter of the law and not on the substance, you that focus on the outward signs and forget that it's about what's inside you, and that forgets it's not about the rule but about the love of God. He says, you are like those unmarked graves. You are a death trap for the people. Jesus bucked the trend of his day, and he paid a price for it. Because when you buck the trend, when you go against the prevailing winds, when you swim against the current, there is a price to pay for it. And I'm so proud to be associated with people that are bucking trends. It's in my genes, literally, to do that. I can tell you long stories about my grandfather, in every sense what he did, on both sides. I'm proud of people who buck the trends and that we can walk together as God's people. But we have to realize there is a price to pay for that. Bucking the trend requires hard work. It requires not only uncommon wisdom, but uncommon commitment. And most often, uncommon courage. And an uncommon display of compassion. Not only to the world, but sometimes especially to those closest to you and the people that you sit with in the pews and the people that you cook with at the fair. I cooked with Krista Friday evening. It's one of the more difficult things I think that there is to do for a husband and wife couple. Because at home she's in charge of the kitchen. I enjoy what she produces, and there, it's not clear who's in charge. But we managed to get through it without seeking a lawyer. But it requires commitment, courage, and especially a willingness to be led by the Spirit so that we can fulfill our mission that God calls us to fulfill. To be the church that always places God's call first and walk with humility and act with compassion and practice hope-generating actions and lives. So let us embark on this journey and continue on this path as God's people. Not being transformed by the world to be as the world, but to be sufficiently committed as God's people to transform the world and buck all the trends of the world that are negative, so that the world can more closely resemble what Jesus called God's kingdom and God's realm. Let us be rebels in the cause of the kingdom in our hearts and flowing from us into the world. May God help us, and let us help each other in that journey. It is worth it. Amen.